The dress didn't fit. The sleeves swallowed her arms. The hem dragged across the stone floor like a shadow that didn't belong to her. She was 10. She still slept with her doll, still skipped stones when no one was looking, still had milk teeth. But that day, they told her she was a wife. The bells rang as if there was something to celebrate. The guests smiled as if they weren't watching a child walk into a cage. And the man beside her, 20 years older, gripped her hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because they warned her not to. Good wives are quiet. The priest looked bored. Her mother looked proud. Her father looked rich. No one looked at her face. When they placed the veil over her eyes, the world disappeared. She remembers the lace pressing into her lips, the wax of the candle dripping too close to her foot, the smell of the man's breath as he leaned down and said, "Smile or I'll make you." The room erupted in applause. The music started, someone handed her a flower, and the door behind her closed. It wasn't a ceremony, it was a burial. That night she was led to a chamber bigger than her entire house. The bed was too high, the sheets too clean, the silence too loud. She stood there, still in the dress, her arms numb, her knees shaking, and waited. Because she didn't know what came next. No one had told her. Not really. Just whispers. Just warnings. Just the way the older girls went quiet when the word wedding was mentioned. He entered with wine. He said nothing. He bolted the door behind him, and when he reached for her, she flinched. That's when he smiled. Not kindly, but like someone who had waited a long time to hurt something small. She was too young to name it, too innocent to fight it, too scared to scream. She laid still, because that's what good wives did. The next morning, they congratulated her. They told her she'd done well. They gave her sweetmeats and silks. They braided her hair and praised her obedience. No one asked how she slept. No one asked if she bled. No one asked anything, because her voice didn't matter. She was now a lady, a title she wore like a bruise beneath silk, and from that day forward, she belonged to him, her body, her silence, her future. She didn't speak much after that, not out of modesty, but because there was no space left inside her for words. You're not supposed to know her name. History forgets girls like her, on purpose. But if you're still here, it means you're listening. It means you care about the stories they tried to erase. So like, subscribe, and share this video. Because this is where her voice begins. Not in the history books, but in your ears. By 12, she had learned not to ask questions. Not because she didn't have any, but because answers were given with the back of a hand. She once asked why the door stayed locked from the outside. She woke up the next morning with a welt on her shoulder and no memory of falling asleep. She once looked too long at a stable boy. 3 days later, she couldn't chew solid food. They didn't call it abuse. They called it correction. They said she was headstrong. They said she needed discipline. But what they meant was this. She needed to forget who she was and remember who she now belonged to. Every mistake had a lesson. Every lesson had a bruise. And every bruise was hidden beneath silk and smiles before she was led out to face the world again. They gave her rules instead of affection. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't run. Don't laugh too loud. Don't eat before he does. Don't cry where anyone can see you. She learned quickly that pain was safer than attention. When he ignored her, she breathed easier. When he looked at her, she braced. He never hit her where it showed. But sometimes, he didn't need to hit her at all. There was a look he gave her, quiet, pointed, stretched too long. It froze her more than any belt. The servants didn't interfere. They whispered behind closed doors, but they curtsied when he passed. They dressed her wounds with cold water and colder words. "He's your husband." "Better he'd do it than someone worse. You must have given him a reason." And over time, she began to believe them, that the pain was part of the bargain, that obedience earned safety, that survival was found in stillness. So she stopped reacting. When the cup was thrown, she ducked without blinking. When her wrist was twisted, she held her breath instead of screaming. When he dragged her by the arm, she followed without resistance. Because bruises faded. But noise made things worse. By 12, she was a ghost in her own home, present but not there, alive but not awake. Sometimes she stared at the hearth for hours, watching the flames eat the wood, wishing her thoughts would burn away too. And yet, beneath the silence, beneath the flinching, beneath the hollowed eyes, something small stayed lit. Not hope, not yet, but memory. She remembered what it felt like to run barefoot through grass, to laugh so hard it hurt, to touch a book and believe in stories. And even though they beat her voice into dust, they never managed to silence the part of her that knew she wasn't born for this. She was 10 when they married her, 12 when they began to break her. But the girl inside was still watching, still listening, still waiting, for the day she'd speak again, not in apology, but in power. By 13, she had mastered stillness, the kind that made people forget she was even in the room. She walked without noise, sat without shifting, smiled when asked. Never first, never too long. Her words came only when summoned, and even then, measured, short, safe, software. But inside, her mind was anything but quiet, because when you're not allowed to speak, you learn to listen. And she listened to everything, to the way her husband spoke to the steward, differently when he wanted something, to the way the cook's eyes narrowed when the taxes rose, to the way the maids gossiped when they thought she couldn't hear. She stored it all, names, habits, secrets, because power doesn't begin with strength. It begins with knowing what other people want. And at 13, she knew what every person in that house feared. She knew the knight with the missing finger avoided the east wing at night. She knew the bishop drank when he fasted. She knew her husband was terrified of being ignored, so she gave him nothing. Not disobedience, not defiance, not even hate, just silence. A silence so polished it began to unnerve him. She'd sit across from him at meals, nod when required, eat exactly the right amount, never too fast, never too little, and he'd frown, because there was nothing to punish. He struck her less often now, not because he'd softened, but because she had become unreadable. He couldn't find the crack anymore, and men like him only know how to strike when something is already broken. She began to read in secret. Religious texts, histories, court records. She read about queens who ruled through heirs, about widows who ran estates, about noblewomen who poisoned, plotted and survived. And with every page she rewrote the story they had written for her. She began to write letters. At first, only thank yous, then requests, then suggestions, carefully framed. By the time she was 14, older women at court had begun to notice her. Not because she was charming, but because she was useful. She remembered things, followed orders, never overstepped. They thought she was obedient. They were wrong. She was studying. Every glance, every lie, every punishment, each one a lesson. She learned how to delay a command without defying it, how to flatter a man's pride while exposing his weakness, how to cry without tears and speak without saying anything at all. Her silence wasn't submission anymore. It was strategy, because in a world that expected her to be invisible, she realized something terrifying. They never looked closely enough to see what she was becoming. A child who once shook when a door creaked at night was now standing quietly in rooms full of nobles, listening for cracks in alliances, smiling while memorizing faces, gathering the kind of power no one saw until it was too late. And all they said of her was, "She's very well behaved." Yes, she was, and they'd regret it. It happened at dinner, a long table, silver cutlery, candles tall enough to cast shadows on the ceiling, the room full of people who believed themselves important. She sat where she always sat, 3 seats down, silent, dressed in pale gold. A girl among adults, or so they thought. The lord beside her made a joke. One of those jokes that circles a woman's worth like a vulture, veiled just enough to be tolerated, cruel just enough to draw a laugh. It landed. People chuckled. Even her husband grinned. She didn't. And when the room fell back into its usual rhythm, she spoke. Just one sentence. Not loud, not angry, not hysterical, just clear. If your wit were as sharp as your sword, perhaps you'd still have both hands. A few things happened at once. The servant dropped a goblet. The noble across from her choked on his pheasant, and the lord, the one with the joke, stared at her as if the chair had spoken. Because for the first time, the girl in gold had drawn blood without raising her voice. Her husband's face turned red, not with rage, with something worse, confusion. He didn't understand what had just happened, only that he didn't like it, only that the room had noticed it. She dipped her head, lifted her cup, smiled, and drank. That night he slapped her, hard, twice. But the sting faded quickly, because this time she knew exactly why it had happened. Because he had heard her, because they had heard her, and now they'd start watching her differently. The women who once pitied her leaned in. The men who once ignored her lowered their voices around her. The servants moved quicker when she entered the room, and she knew it wouldn't take screaming, it wouldn't take rebellion, it would take precision. A word here, a correction there, a reminder that she may be small, but she was listening. She didn't speak again for days. She didn't need to. The damage was done. The illusion was cracked. They could pretend she was still docile, still trained, still tame. But they knew now, beneath the veil and the pleasantries, there was something sharp, something that had waited years for just one opportunity to bleed through the silence. And it had only just begun. She never interrupted. She didn't need to. She could hear what they were going to say before their mouths even opened. She could see it in the shift of their weight, in the twitch of a jaw, in the way their fingers curled around the edge of a goblet when they were about to lie. She became a mirror they didn't realize they were looking into. A girl who knew how to look down with respect, but who missed nothing. At 16, she could finish a man's sentence in her mind before he thought of the second word. She watched them bluff, stumble, flirt, command, and she memorized what made them powerful and what made them weak. Some men hid their fear behind volume, others behind religion, and some simply hid behind her. She smiled at all of them and remembered every detail. She knew how long a man would speak before apologizing, how long before a boast turned into a confession, how long before his eyes betrayed what his words refused to say, and she started to play with it. Softly, subtly. She'd adjust her tone to mirror theirs. She'd blink at just the right moment to make them feel clever. She'd offer agreement that felt earned, so they'd come back for more. She could twist a room around a single raised eyebrow, and no one noticed the string in her hand. Because she wasn't trying to charm them. She was trying to understand them. She had learned what no one taught. Men who believe you admire them will never see you coming. And those were the ones she feared most, the ones who wanted to be seen as strong, because those were the ones who struck hardest when they were questioned, who tore down what they couldn't control. But she knew how to become the kind of woman they would never question, the one who listened, who nodded, who understood her place. And while they explained themselves to her, while they bragged and lectured and bared their strategies, she was mapping every one of them, their ambitions, their alliances, their limits. She became fluent in their insecurities and used them like keys. She could open any door or lock it behind them. The same girl they silenced at 10, beat at 12, and underestimated at 15 was now guiding entire conversations without speaking more than a few words. They thought they were leading her, but they were performing for her. Because no one sees the trap when it looks like praise. It began with a disappearance, A man who once laughed too freely in her presence, gone. Sent abroad, they said. No letters, no funeral, no explanation. Then a cousin, then a steward, then the priest who married her off when she was 10. Each vanished with a whisper, each replaced without ceremony. She never touched a blade, never raised her voice, never left a single trace. But people started stepping aside when she walked into a room, not out of respect, out of calculation, because by now they had seen what happened to those who underestimated her. She was no longer a girl in gold, she was a woman dressed in shadow. No titles had been granted, no crown had been placed, but she had authority just the same, the kind that doesn't need permission. She started speaking more in council, always brief, always careful. But when she spoke, people listened, because behind every word was the silent question, who disappears next? She managed estates without being named mistress. She appointed men without being named regent. She vetoed decisions without being given the throne. No one challenged it. Because the most dangerous power is the kind no one can see clearly, and those who tried to confront her, those who whispered too loud, those who threatened to expose her, they made mistakes. They thought she'd argue, that she'd protest, that she'd lash out, but she didn't. She simply waited. And when they fell, no one could trace the fall back to her, because power, she'd learned, wasn't about force, it was about control. Control of secrets, control of silence, control of how people tell stories after you're gone, and she controlled them all, even her husband, the one who once dragged her by the wrist through corridors, now asked her before making decisions. He didn't love her, he didn't fear her, but he knew better than to ignore her. Because in the span of a few years she had become what every man in power quietly dreads, a woman who sees everything, says nothing, and never forgets. She had no throne, but ruled through absence, no army, but conquered through reputation, no confession, but every death was a monument to her rise. She didn't need marble statues, she had shadows, and by now, even they answered to her. They never crowned her. But she didn't need a crown. Her power didn't sit on her head, it walked with her. Every time she entered a chamber, the temperature changed. Men stopped talking, women straightened their backs. The guards, who once dismissed her as a girl, now opened doors without being asked. She didn't rule a kingdom, she ruled people, and people talked. They said she had the ear of the king, that she influenced his council, that nobles owed her favours they never admitted, that her signature, though unofficial, meant more than most royal seals. She never confirmed it. She didn't have to. Her silence was now louder than any title. Couriers rode days just to deliver letters to her. Widows begged for her help settling disputes. Clergymen asked her to intervene in matters of state. And all the while she spoke calmly, carefully, deliberately, never too much, never too little. Because her power wasn't in what she said. It was in what others feared she might say next. She knew every noble secret, every affair, every betrayal, every false prayer whispered in the dark. She kept records, not on paper, but in memory, and no one dared to test what she remembered. She dressed plainly, on purpose, no rubies, no crowns, just pearl-threaded sleeves and a ring with no inscription. Because when you've built your empire out of silence, you don't need decoration. She didn't throw parties, she hosted audiences, she didn't flirt, she examined, she didn't beg. People volunteered, even her husband, older now, quieter, greyer, introduced her as his most trusted companion. He never touched her arm in public, never raised his voice, never looked her in the eye for too long. Because he knew, everyone knew, that whatever she had been at 10, whatever was stolen at 12, whatever was beaten down and buried under silk, was gone. And what rose in its place was a force that didn't need violence, didn't need chaos, didn't even need recognition. She had turned every bruise into a lesson, every silence into a strategy, every humiliation into a map of how men collapse, and now she was the quiet breath between laws, the pause between decisions, the smile that made enemies doubt themselves. She wasn't just powerful, she was inevitable. The portraits show her with calm eyes, neck long, hands folded, composure painted into every brushstroke. No hint of what she'd been before power found her, before she carved her name into history, without ever writing it down. Visitors bowed, servants whispered, children watched her pass like she was a story that had come to life, one they didn't fully understand, but no one, not even once, asked her if she was happy. They asked how she managed the estates, how she advised the king, how she kept the peace. But not about the girl who once bled into lace sheets at 10, not about the nights she stared at the fire and wished for silence deep enough to sleep in, not about the memory of a handprint that never fully left her cheek, because power is a costume, and she wore it well, so well that even she forgot sometimes what it felt like to be small. She had everything now, and nothing she wanted then. No meadow to run in, no breath without consequence, no voice that belonged only to her. She had become a monument, not a person, not a wife, not a child, just a presence. They thought she won. But what they never understood is this: you don't win when you survive something like that. You adapt. You build your walls from the inside out. You stop feeling certain things so you can keep moving. And one day, you realize. You've been walking on a battlefield so long you forgot what peace even looked like. There were rumours she wept once, quietly, in a chapel when no one was supposed to see. The candle had gone out early. The stone floor was cold. She knelt for a long time, hands clenched in her lap, and said nothing. No prayers, no pleas, just silence. The same silence she had once been buried in. But now she wore it like a crown. And when she stood again, there was no trace of tears, only composure, only the woman they all knew, only the girl they never tried to save. She walked out of the chapel and the guards stood straighter. The maids dropped their eyes, the court resumed its games, and no one asked her anything, because by now they understood. You do not question the most powerful woman in England, not about her rise, and never about her ruin.